Welcome to a brand new episode of Talking Law from Women in the Law UK. I'm Sally Penni MBE, a barrister at Kenworthy's Chambers in Manchester, the Joint Vice Chair of the Association of Women Barristers and the founder of Women in the Law UK. If you haven't had a chance to visit, then do visit womeninthelawuk.com. Please do go and have a look at all the free resources available to anyone who works within the law, including webinars, covering a range of topics from tips on becoming general counsel to dealing with imposter syndrome to career management and career progression. There is also a series of Talking Law books which are available on Amazon with profits going to charity, the latest of which is Talking Law and Skills, which covers a whole range of skills required as we return post-pandemic. There are also a range of books by me, Sally Penni, on employment rights and data protection cybersecurity. Today on Talking Law, I'm interviewing a barrister who, unlike many of my guests, didn't grow up with a desire to work in the law. Called to the bar in 1995, Iain Simkin is renowned for his expertise across a range of regulatory cases, and he also specialises in serious crime. He practices at the highly esteemed chambers of Dean's Court in Manchester, which won Legal Set of the Year in 2020 Chambers Bar Awards. To start our conversation, Iain shared an extraordinary fact with me about how different his life would have been if he'd been successful in his first choice of career.
So to begin with, Sally, I wanted to be an actor.
Oh.
And I was committed to being an actor and appearing on stage. But I had that kind of acting isn't a real job attitude from somewhere. I don't quite know where it came from. So I sort of alighted on the notion that being a barrister was acting and writing your own lines to a degree at the same time. So I never wanted to be a solicitor. I always wanted to be a barrister. I always wanted to be in court. And I have to tell you that I've started many jury trial speeches by telling the jury that, of course, I never really wanted to be a barrister. What I wanted to be was an actor. And so that was my initial excitement about being a barrister. And then I became it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, doing law,
yeah.
you do stuff that most people don't see in their lives. You come across a range of different topics that unfold in a range of different ways. And it's a sort of fascinating intellectually and exciting in a kind of theatrical way as well. That's why law.
And did you know any lawyers? I mean, sometimes people come from long families of lawyers. I mean, what was your journey into law? It was quite a hard one.
So I knew absolutely no lawyers whatsoever. I didn't know anybody. And I did a degree in the first place in economics.
Oh.
But I've got a degree in economics. So I was pretty bored by that by the end of it. And I fancied being a lawyer. So I did the conversion course called the CPE then. I'm not sure what it's called now.
GDL.
Is that right? You kind of converted your degree from a economics degree and you did the 6 core subjects of law in a year. And even then I didn't know any lawyers, but I started, of course, to get to know other people who wanted to be lawyers as well. And then from there, I suppose I threw myself into it. So you get mini pupilages, don't you? And I worked at a city centre, a city law firm in central London for a while. And I worked in various mini pupilages at various chambers. And I went marshalling and I did everything I could to find out what it was like, but also, of course, make those connections that are so important, aren't they?
Yes, yeah.
To understand who's where and how, if at all, you ought to apply. And so that was the way in. And I couldn't get to be a barrister. I qualified the year before. I was called in 95, but in fact, I was the 94 intake at bar school. And I didn't get called because I couldn't get anywhere. And I ended up working in a building society, in the Britannia Building Society in Stoke-on-Trent. And I couldn't get anywhere. And I wrote 500 letters for pupillage, handwritten. So it was a long, long journey and it was a great deal of effort. But a friend of mine said to me, if you try harder than everybody else, you'll get there in the end. And he was right. And that's what I did. I just didn't give up. And so I managed to get pupillage, and my pupil master's currently for the families in the arena bombing inquiry in Manchester, John Cooper, QC. And I got pupillage with him in London.
Wow. Well, that's quite a story, actually, Iain. 500 letters. I thought I wrote a lot, but I think that beats even me. But, that advice is so important, not to give up and to carry on going, really. That was then, and this is now, and you're somewhat of a success. Barrister at Dean's Court Chambers. I'd like to know a memorable case for you, or memorable cases as far as you're concerned. You've got so many. And you appeared as prosecuting counsel in the case of Reynhard Sinaga. Now, it's a memorable case for me because I was also in it, albeit less so than you. Would you say that that's your most memorable case? Would you agree with me? And can you tell us a bit about it? Because that case involved everything.
Yes, that is the most memorable case I've been involved in. It's by far the most high-profile case I've ever done. It was the lead item on the evening news across all broadcast networks. It was front page news on, I think, every newspaper the following day. It was reported internationally. I'm due to be on a documentary on BBC Two about it. So it was a very, had a great deal of impact so far as capturing really the news agencies, at least imagination.
Yes.
The case itself was the most shocking set of circumstances, really.
Yeah.
There were a large number of young men who had been raped by Reynhard Sinaga. The police think up to about 200, of whom about 140 or thereabouts were identified. Ultimately, 48 gave evidence as to what they had suffered over 4 trials. And without going into the law about it, there were a number of difficult aspects of law.
Yes.
There were a number of difficult evidential aspects with regard to it. Of course, it had all been videoed as well, which in some ways made it easier, and in other ways, I have to say, made it harder. The presentation of the evidence was really difficult, really. It was always a case I was confident I could win. I was confident the prosecution would win, to be fair. But the difficulty wasn't winning. The difficulty was presenting the evidence in the right way. And of course, that's often the case, isn't it, at the bar? It's getting the evidence to the jury in the right way when you're prosecuting, such that they can found a conviction upon it. So all of those things were there. It took up 2 years of my life. It culminated in an AG reference where I was standing behind the Solicitor General next to the Attorney General in front of the full court.
Yeah, out of 5 judges.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, I've always loved the Court of Appeal, though. People get frightened. I've always thought it was great. It's why you want to be at the bar, isn't it? You want to get down and get excited and get challenged, really.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that. That was great. It was an extraordinary thing to be part of, and as a career high, it was amazing. But of course, like all these things, when you do criminal law, it's an absolute human tragedy which is unfolded that you're part of. So there's always that juxtaposition of those two competing things, isn't there?
Yes.
A great murder. I was involved in some great murder, you may say, as counsel, but of course that means that someone's been killed.
Yes.
So there's always those tensions between the two things.
There are.
That was my most interesting case, I think. That's the one that people ask me about. Because if you Google me, that's what you get.
Oh dear.
That's the answer. Forever synonymous with the world's most prolific rapist. But there we are. There's not much I can do, right?
Yes. Well, if I may say so, you did it so well. Now, we talk at length about that case in my other podcast, which is just about the law. So people can listen to, our discussion there about all the different aspects of law and advocacy and trial preparation there. But Iain, I want to ask you about another case of yours where O'Ketch, and I know you do other things other than sexual offences, you're involved in murder cases, inquests, you're very experienced counsel. But O'Ketch, because there's a BBC documentary about that case as well, which I consider, for all the wrong reasons, memorable, where the hands of the defendant witness. Can you just talk to me briefly about that, and then I'll move on?
Yeah, so Jeremy Aketch was a case where he had raped a young child, his girlfriend's child, I think, from memory. And he had filmed himself again, having done so, but his face was obscured. And so we looked to find evidence that would demonstrate, again, beyond any reasonable doubt, that it was him. And I think her name's Professor Black, Lady Black.
Yes.
Who is a specialist in this area in Scotland, in Dundee.
Yeah, she is. I know her well.
Yeah, she's ever such a nice woman. And when we had a photograph of Mr. Aketch's hands that had been taken when he went into custody, and we had filming of the offences, which were, again, extraordinarily graphic, but only his hands were on show. And she was able to look at the venal pattern on the back of his hands. That's Mr. Aketch's hands. And then effectively map them. So she created these maps of the two hands, and they then were compared to the pictures that were gleaned from the video recordings, and the two matched, the veins matched. But he did have on his, I think it was his right ring finger, he had a birthmark, which was a brown line that went underneath his nail on his ring finger on his right hand, like a sort of tan line that went forward, and that matched as well. So once we had that evidence, he didn't go for trial, Mr. Aketch, because it was conclusive, that evidence, and he pleaded guilty ultimately. But that too was an interesting case, and we thought about using Lady Black so far as Sinaga was concerned, but he admitted presence, so it wasn't something that we needed to do. So it was for identification purposes that she had been called by the police to assist. But again, it was an unusual case. Again, horrific.
Yes.
So far as its facts are concerned.
Yes. Well, I'll deal with sort of well-being towards the end of the podcast, really. But I wonder if, just very briefly, a case that you've just finished is Jack Barnes, which has analogies with George Floyd, who was murdered in the United States and was a spark of the Black Lives Matter protests in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic in last year, 2020. And so I wonder if you, because that's only just concluded, that case, hasn't it?
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah. And again, interesting aspect, because you appeared in that in the inquest. And a lot of counsel, and in fact, you were appearing for Metrolink.
Not for Metrolink, Transport for Greater Manchester.
Forgive me.
Who are the public body that then, if you like, people bid to Transport for Greater Manchester to use the Metrolink. But they are the governmental body in charge. And they were the reason why it was made an Article 2 inquest in the first place. I mean, I don't need to go into too much detail in this podcast, but that meant that the senior coroner of Manchester, Mr. Meadows, could widen the scope in the first instance of his investigation into what took place. Therefore, we looked at a range of different factors so far as Mr. Barnes' death was concerned, which was wide-ranging, really. It was a very wide-ranging inquest, I have to say, that culminated in unlawful killing so far as the coronial aspect of it. I don't know what the prosecution are doing. I'm afraid I can't comment with regard to that.
Yes, well, I could deal with that again on the Law and Guidance podcast, because it is quite an interesting case, and the evidence and the law used is quite interesting. So, Iain, I've been at the bar now 20 years, 21 in October. You've been 20, is it 26 years, or are you closer to 30?
No, 25 or 6. No, let's call it 25, shall we? They're on the side of cause.
Yes, quite. When one starts, or maybe this is about me, you often get very aggressive and aggro in court and cross-examination and so on. And as the years go by, all that sort of falls aside, and, we will become much gentler. Of course, there are cases that warrant a certain type of cross-examination. So my question is about really any kind of advice on advocacy, and then advice for young people wanting to enter the profession.
So my style of advocacy, I think, although it's always better if somebody tells you rather than what you're able to analyse for yourself, I think I look for collegiality with the jury. So I ask questions which aren't, I think now, overly aggressive. I did when I was younger, certainly, ask overly aggressive questions. But I don't think I do now. I think I ask questions to get the answers that I want. I ask questions that the defendant doesn't expect. But really, I ask questions that pique, I imagine, the interest of the jury so that they listen to what I say. And so when I ask a question and I get the answer from a witness, and that, of course, that question is designed to either exculpate or inculpate the witness, depending on which side I represent, I'm hoping that the way in which I ask the question, the fact that they're already with me, the jury, with this sense of collegiality, means that they remember the answers that were given in favor of my case at the time that they were given, and that when I go back to them in my speech, I can then make the points I need to make based on those answers. And so judge advocacy, as you know, is very different, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Jury
advocacy.
Jury,
yeah.
But with regard to jury advocacy, you want that sense of collegiality, and you want that sense of, you don't want to be an absurdity as far as the jury is concerned. Sometimes, of course, it's a function of the evidence, isn't it? And if you're defending, particularly when you're defending in the face of overwhelming evidence that is unimpeachable as far as the defense is concerned, there is a risk that you can look unrealistic so far as the questions you're posing and the evidence which you're able to gather. But as long as you can avoid that, you can take them with you. And then when it comes to judge advocacy, you just need to make the points, don't you, in a polite, forceful when necessary, but persuasive way, and manipulate the law to support what you want to say to the court, but always get the answer you want, really. Lots of people talk for a long time, don't they?
Yes.
Very long run up to the wicket. Well, I don't really do that.
Yeah.
I'd rather just make the point once well and invite the judge to come with me. There's a power of repetition in jury advocacy, but I think if you've got a decent judge, then you don't really need to do that.
No.
But, succinct, on point, and always be persuasive would be judge advocacy for me.
Brilliant. That's a really good advice. Now, what about sort of the young Iain or young people entering the profession now? Because, let's face it, the COVID is really disrupted the opportunities for people wanting to enter the profession presently. And now more than ever, they need to be more resilient and they need to keep going. Have you got any advice for people who are wondering, am I ever going to get into this job? How will I get in? How can I better myself?
When you introduced me on this podcast, or I kept some newspapers of cases I've done, not very many, in the loft. I know it's a bit cheesy, but I have. And I kind of look at these things sometimes, and I'm sort of amazed that I've done it. Right? I'm just kind of amazed that I got there and that I did these cases, or I managed to sustain a career over 25 years. And so I was where I think these young people are. I genuinely think I thought it was impossibly difficult to get in. It was impossibly expensive. I didn't really know how I'd manage. I imagine COVID, of course, aggravates everything much further, doesn't it? Because there's so few court hearings. You can't sort of hoover up the sort of bits at the bottom, if you like, and make a fair crust doing that. It's just not there to be had. So it's very, very hard. And they do have my absolute sympathy. I think all you can say is never give up. So I remember I was in hospital and there was a chap from Yorkshire opposite me in hospital. He was a great guy. And he gave me some advice, which was, I don't know why he gave me the advice. He just still told me anyway. I must have looked like I needed advice. And he said, some balls you'll hit and some balls you'll miss, but never drop the bat. And I think that is good advice, because you are going to miss. You are going to make mistakes. Things aren't always going to go right, but never, ever give up. And really tenacity if you want to be a barrister. And just keep trying. And however you can get there, there is no other way of doing it other than determination. And there are lots of rich people who want to be barristers. lots of sons and daughters of judges and the like, and who are no doubt better able, it seems to me, to sustain long-term poverty or mock poverty, if you understand. They can soak it up for much longer, can't they? That's dispiriting. It must be really dispiriting if you haven't got that backup. But you just have to keep trying, find a way. I lived in a shared house with loads of people. It was great. I lived in London in my 20s with loads of other lads, and we had a fantastic time. And they were all much richer than I was, because I didn't get anything at all. But I managed only just though, it has to be said. And I did drop out for a while and have a kind of real job for a couple of years, because it was not sustainable living in London as a barrister. So I became a management consultant for a couple of years, and I saved up and went back in. But I went back in Manchester.
Yes.
That's easier to live in Manchester than it is in London.
Absolutely.
For free.
Yes. Yes.
Perhaps not now.
No, it's changed somewhat, hasn't it? That's great advice. But I wonder, what about in terms of retention? And the attrition rates at the bar, particularly for women, aren't great. And actually for men in publicly funded work isn't great. People leaving all the time. And you've been at the bar now for quite a long time. And I wondered if you had any advice for retention or remaining at the bar, essentially to keep going.
Well, there's a lot in that question.
Yeah,
isn't there,
it's quite a big
Sally?
question.
So,
yeah.
It's a bit, in terms of retention for women at the bar, I think the stats are pretty depressing, aren't they?
Yeah, they are.
So I think for retaining, particularly after childbirth, retaining women at the bar is really quite poor. Not so bad for men, although men do drop out. When I've been in my career in Manchester in particular, there's been lots of really good practitioners who've just dropped out because I just think they find it too onerous, the amount of work. Or they don't like it anymore. But significant number of men and women I've known over the past however many years. So I've been here for 20 years now. So over the past 20 years have dropped away. For me, I've tried to push myself so that I don't just do the same thing all the time. So for a long time, I was a rape specialist. I prosecuted large numbers of rapes. I think one year, a few years ago, I think I did like 30 weeks back to back of rape trials, which is just too many. And I just think that I've moved. That was a stage in my career. And I remember the now recorder of Liverpool, Andrew Maneri, telling me it would just be a stage in your career, that you have to move forward. Otherwise, you can get trapped, can't you, in doing that work, I think.
Yes, and of course...
all the time.
Yes, women do. You end up just doing back-to-back, sex. You never do a fraud, you never do an inquest, you never do anything that's varied.
It's particularly bad, isn't it, for women? I think they get stereotyped at doing that work, which I don't really know why. But I did it for a long time, but I've tried to do other things, and I have. And so I started doing inquests. I got a friendly solicitor sent me an inquest. It's always the same, isn't it? Chicken or egg, which comes first? You have to get the instructions. And so I took 2 weeks off work and I shadowed Nigel Meadows.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
Nigel Meadows for a fortnight, sat next to him. It's absolutely fascinating, the inquest he did. But at least I wasn't going into it blind. I had an idea of what I was doing. And I've done that a few times with various different types of work. So I do health and safety work, and I follow practitioners who are doing that, inquests. I've done a range of different sorts of tribunals, upper tribunal work, just try and keep it varied, keep it interesting. But, in the end, I suppose truly, I'm a sort of criminal lawyer, aren't I? So my tendency is always going to be to do jury trials. I like jury trials. I like advocacy. I like speaking to a jury. And I don't do anywhere near as many as I used to. And I do specialise in health and safety and environmental and regulatory law, and I do professional discipline as well. But I will always do crime. And I make it very plain that I'll always do crime, because I just don't think I could ever leave my first true love.
Yes. Well, that's very well put, actually. Mine too, very well put. Iain, can I ask you about favourite book and a favourite fictional lawyer?
Favourite book changes. So an avid reader. I've read, and I keep them. I have this bookcase, which nobody ever sees but me, and I rather sort of pathetically look at it, and I'm so proud of what I've read, but now it's ridiculous. So at the moment, my favourite book is The Grapes of Wrath by Steinbeck. So I read it last year, and it's breathtakingly well written. I mean, people know this, don't they? They know Steinbeck writes well. It's not news, but it's breathtakingly well written. The story is horrific. It's just awful, so depressing. It's not funny at all. And the family, but in the first chapter, for example, that he talks about the dust in Oklahoma, and the dust is a character in the book. It's incredibly well written. It's like poetry. And when I read it, there were chapters that I would immediately read again because it was wonderfully evocative of the time. It was sentimental without being cheesy. It was poignant, gothic horror. It was just a fantastic read. And so that, I think, is my favourite book for now. But it will change.
Do you tend to read sort of darker books?
I'm afraid I do. So I love Kafka as well.
Oh, yes.
But love it. I mean, it's so weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I love it. And I've read all round it as well. And so I remember going on holiday, and one year I read Primo Levi. Familiar with Primo Levi, the Auschwitz survivor, the Italian Auschwitz survivor. I've read a lot of his very dark work. And I read Dostoevsky, who was interred in a prison camp in Siberia, The House of the Dead. I read one holiday. And then the following holiday, I read A Day in the Life of Ivan, is it?
Oh, yeah.
Ivan Izinovich.
Yes.
Which is by Solzhenitsyn. So it's the same story.
Yes.
100 years apart.
Yeah.
And I wondered, why am I reading this in Tenerife with my children? This is not uplifting, but I do get a lot from these. Denisovich, isn't it? Ivan Denisovich. I do get a great deal from these kind of dark books and Kafka and Camus and those sorts of things. But I do read them for fun, which sounds odd, doesn't it?
Yes, but you're in control of that as opposed to doing, quite difficult cases. And, it's escapism. It's escapism.
It is, yeah. I mean, it's so far away from my own experiences, isn't it?
Yes.
I suppose it is escapism.
Yes, it is. And what about your favourite fictional lawyer?
So he comes from what was my favourite book for a long time, which is Atticus from
To Kill a Mockingbird.
To Kill a Mockingbird. And I know it's a bit of a cliche. And I think it's because I've seen the film when Gregory Peck plays Atticus. And in my own mind, I've read it. It's a book I've read about 3 or 4 times. But in my own mind, of course, Atticus is Gregory Peck. He's so in control, isn't he?
Yes.
He's so in control of the trial process, and it's justice as well. He's fighting for justice. But it's a beautiful book, isn't it? That's written through the eyes of a 5-year-old child.
Yes.
Injustice burning in the eyes of a child. Wonderful. And I read is it Go Set a Watchman, which I found hugely disappointing.
Yes, I know.
Yeah, I didn't like it at all.
No, I didn't.
But I thought To Kill a Mockingbird was amazing. And that was my favourite book for a long time, but not now.
Yes. Iain, I want to ask you about well-being. We are the bar. I think, the bar council's been doing loads on, well-being of the bar, the fact that we need to get out more, especially in the pandemic, fresh air. But the fact is, long hours, returns, complicated indictment drafting. I know I'm not just talking about myself when I say this, but in general, we could be better. And so I wondered what you do for your well-being, because you've been shielding as well, because you mentioned hospital before, and you're a transplant patient, and you spend a lot of time also talking about encouraging organ donation afterwards. So I wonder if we could start from the beginning, really. Firstly, what do you do for your well-being? And then secondly, can you tell us about having to shield as a transplant patient?
I've got 4 boys, as you know.
Yeah,
Sally.
yeah.
So they're aged 14, 11, 8 and 5. And so most of the time, I like to try and be a dad. And so well-being means forgetting about work, but it's not a conscious choice. I just have to, because I have to do everything that's involved with being a full-time father of 4.
Yes.
And that it takes it all away, doesn't it? You haven't time to think about anything else. And what, of course, parenting does, and I know that you know, it burns time, doesn't it, really, in a way that hardly anything else can. The risk with being a parent, a full-time parent and a barrister, is that there's no other time left over. But I do make time, and I play the guitar, and I read, and I watch TV. I do that. I'm good at it.
Are you?
Switch off. I think so. I think I am quite good at it.
I have to ask your wife.
Yeah, well, she thinks I'm lazy, so the answer is yes. But I think I am quite good at turning off, switching off, and forgetting about it. And I've been able always really to compartmentalize things, with the exception of the 2 cases you started off with, which were Okech and Sinaga. And the reason I think for that is that the offences were filmed, and I can remember the films very clearly, particularly Okech, actually. And I won't describe it, obviously, but it's a very graphic film that I remember with a young child. And of course, I've had at the time young children, and it was extremely distressing to watch. I remember the judge commented on how distressed she was. That was difficult to switch off. I don't quite know how you get rid of that. I just sort of cope with it. I don't think about it all the time, obviously not, but it's there.
No.
But in the main, I can switch off and I can do other things. And I go into kind of trance-like state while I badly play the guitar over and over the same riff till I finally got it right. That's what I do. And with regard to shielding,
yes,
from 13 I had kidney disease, and at 43, so they did quite well.
Yes.
At 43 I had a kidney transplant, which was, life-changing and life-affirming. So I can't recommend organ transplantation highly enough, let me tell you. Beforehand, I was dialyzing, which is, I found a tyranny. I know some people cope with it quite well, but I find it very, very painful, very draining. I fell asleep in court once in front of a judge. He was very nice about it, but I mean, I'd got to a point where I was really quite ill and I was still working. And I think that's being a barrister, of course. I think if I hadn't been self-employed and if I hadn't been at the bar, I don't think I would have been working. And I thought my intellectual capacity wasn't in any way affected, but certainly my stamina was very, very poor at one point. And Judge Everett, who's now the recorder of Chester, the honorary recorder of Chester, I fell asleep in front of him while he was talking to me, which he wasn't cross. He said he understood what was going on, and they locked the court and left me in there for 45 minutes to sleep. And afterwards I was all right. But so that, I went through that, and I went through a transplant. And then, of course, when the COVID pandemic broke, there were the letters sent to various people. And the first group on the list of those who ought to shield were solid organ transplantation patients. So I've stayed in, more or less, since March of last year. I've done some hearings over the internet. There was that lacuna, wasn't there, in the summer?
Yes.
Where it was better. I did a couple of trials then, but only 2 or 3, I think. And everything else I've done, I've had to do over the internet, which is, you can't really, I've not done a Crown Court trial over the internet, but I've done some tribunal work and inquests over the internet. But that's all I've been able to do. So it's had an effect, shielding. But it's, the alternatives are not to be countenanced, really, are they? I don't want to get ill. I was worried about getting ill. But I've had the injection, I've had the vaccine now, so I'm hoping that I've got my shield of invincibility. At least I'm going to go outside on that basis when I'm allowed to.
Yes, we are, which will be really, really good. We'll be pleased to see you. But Iain, my own son had a transplant, but that wasn't organ. It was genetic and blood. I know the stress and the trauma that comes with a child let alone an adult. And it's really shaped, my ability and to think about the way I work, the way I parent, and to really actually look at doing work which allows to spend more time with the family, but also to speak about what happened. My son's transplant was free Anthony Nolan, which is, stem cells. And so I know, because you and I have a mutual friend, a lawyer at the CPS, or was a CPS, Rada Vaisyanada, that you've been doing quite a lot of work publicly to encourage organ donation when you can. And how's that? Because that takes a guts, doesn't it, to kind of talk about oneself?
So I've been invited by the hospital on a number of occasions and by surgeons to speak to them as a patient representative. So until I was being through this process, I didn't realise how highly patient input was appreciated within the NHS, and how it was a necessity really for research, that there was patient representative, and also with regard to raising awareness so far as other people are concerned as to what can actually be achieved. So I won't name her, but my partner's sister gave me her kidney. So I wasn't matching or anything of that nature. She saw me, she came around, she stayed over with her kids, obviously, because we don't live very far away. And she saw me, I was very ill. On dialysis made me very ill. I was sick a lot. And she saw me and she went home and said, I'm going to give Iain a kidney. So we went through a paired scheme. People aren't aware of this. So there's a scheme whereby if you and I don't match, but you're my donor, then we find another pair whereby they have a donor that doesn't match, but does match me. And then the pairs cross, if you understand what I mean. So that can be achieved. Or you can have a non-matching kidney. And I had a non-matching kidney from my sister-in-law. And it was a fascinating scientific piece. I mean, as a sort of scientific spot, it was fun. It was really interesting. And it worked. But I was a 25th person, I think, to have that in the UK. And everyone had worked, including mine. And then the next person's didn't work. But I think that, the message needs to go out there. There should be more advertising on this. I wanted to make an advert with my sister-in-law, and we're still talking about doing it even now, to show the benefits. So she was off work for 3 weeks. 3 weeks she was off work, having given me a kidney. And I don't want to in any way undermine what she's done. It'd be very clear with the next few sentences. But the actual injury, if you like, to her was 3 weeks off work, and then she went back to work. So, and I was, I think, 18 months maybe left. So I think maybe the doctors were very dismal about my prospects. I learned afterwards, I have to say. And so that's the trade-off, isn't it? And I think that people don't really know when it comes to kidney transplantation. It's not nothing, is it, to give a kidney? And that's never what we would try and say. But it isn't catastrophic to the individual that donates, but it is survival to the recipient. And that's a lesson that needs to be out there. So I've given some talks on that, and I've also talked to doctors who are, surgeons are very amusing, clever people, aren't they? And I have a very good time when I speak to them. So I've been to the BMA a couple of times, spoken to them. So I really enjoy that as well. I do that. And I just factor it in. And they know that sometimes I won't be able to go, that I'm doing, a closing speech in a particular case. Normally the judges, I'll just say to the judge, can I have the day off? And because they know, nearly all the judges now have been through it, you see, in Manchester at least, they accommodate that. Whereas, there are occasions when I can't make it, and they're understanding, the medics are understanding of that problem.
Yes. Well, Iain, I applaud you, because you could have just taken the kidney, be better, and not do anything. And so it's brilliant to see you advocating. And of course, in black and minorities, they have to have a donor from a black person. And of course they've got even less donors coming forward for various cultural reasons, as I understand it. So anybody who speaks to increase the donor list, I've got a lot of time for. But Iain, I want to go back to your work, really, which is why you're on here. You've got a fascinating life, a broad spectrum with some of the most complicated cases legally. And an example of excellence in advocacy. And I want to really ask you, what's next? I mentioned that you're many years at the bar. Much older than me. We must emphasize that, despite my grey hairs.
You haven't got any?
Well, I have. I've just been trying to hide it. It helps. That's why we love jury advocacy, isn't it? Wearing our wig and gown. I can't wear it in the employment tribunals where I appear there. But Iain, I just wonder what's next. Maybe the bench, maybe Queen's Counsel.
Never rule anything out. That's the key point, isn't it? You never rule anything out. So
good.
There are opportunities that present themselves, and they'll come along, and I'll apply and I'll take them. And it's just about timing, and it's just about what's on offer and where I am and where I think I can go forward. It's been a very weird time, hasn't it, for a year? In terms of everyone's career, it's become more of a job, hasn't it, than a career for the past year. So rather than, I was doing really, really well. I said to Kate, who's my partner, things have never been going as well at work. And then 3 weeks later, there was a worldwide pandemic and you couldn't get into court. So you never really know what's in the future. But it's meant that work over 2020 has been predominantly survival, getting enough to go forward and making sure that all the bills are paid and we can all do what we need to do. But with regard to 21, I'm hoping everything opens up, really. I'm pretty confident we're moving in the right direction now. And so as and when opportunity presents itself, I don't rule anything out. I just want to be the best I can be at work whilst I'm able to work. That's my goal. That's my aim.
Yes, and what a brilliant aim as well. And so finally, what would you say to the young Iain? I know that, the young Iain started life, I think, or maybe it didn't start life there at Young Street, and you've got lots of colleagues there. The David Farleys and Sim Evans, and you've got many colleagues. And then, you went elsewhere, and then you're at Dean's Court now. I wonder, what would you say to that the 21-year-old Iain? Any advice for him?
Well, firstly, he should cheer up because he was a dismal so-and-so. But really, just try and enjoy it. And it's a fascinating thing to be involved in. And sometimes, and this is true, isn't it? You'll remember this. I used to call it the fear. I was frightened of going to work for such a long time because it's really hard, isn't it? And the responsibility when you're young is vast. And people go to jail at the end of it, and you think it's your fault. And, invariably it's the evidence and it's not the advocates. But try and watch what's going, learn what the processes are. Don't become overwhelmed by the evidence. Learn the process, learn the mechanism that's being employed, and just know that the top barristers, they're making it up as they go along. Right? They're so confident. They just do what they want to. They ask the right questions, but they haven't really got it as planned as perhaps anybody else might. And the more junior you are, you're kind of overwhelmed by it all. So try and watch, learn, but enjoy as well. I think that's what I would tell myself.
Yes, what great advice, Iain. And I hope that we never see another case like the Reynhard Sinaga case. But any learnings for you from there? I mean, he was convicted of a number of offences over an 18-month period, 4 trials, I think 48 complainants, victims.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if you had any kind of learnings as an advocate after conducting, what's being called the biggest rape trial ever in the UK. I know a lot of the newspapers were calling it that, but any kind of trial learnings from that?
Yeah, so when you face a massive case like that with a huge amount of evidence, you just have to compartmentalize what you're doing and break it down into manageable chunks. You've got to have a map. So I created I told you I was a bit of a spotty geek type. So I created a nice spreadsheet that I could refer to where everything coalesced. But section by section, I had to deal with the chunks of evidence that were needed to be dealt with to build that case. But its impact on me really was more as a man than an advocate. So men get raped. That's what I really took away from that. They're 48 men, and they all led the sort of life I led when I was a student. I was a student in Manchester. That kind of carefree life. They never thought for a moment that anything like that might ever happen to them. And of course, they didn't even know that it had, the overwhelming majority of them. Men get raped too. And so you need to be, on guard to a degree. I mean, everybody wants to live freely, don't they? And there's a great deal in the press about this young woman who's been, murdered recently from when she was walking home.
Yes, Sarah Everard.
It's absolutely appalling that we have to be on guard. And of course, the victims are never responsible for what's happened to them. But these men were not on guard, and they had nothing that they thought they might be on guard for. But men get raped as well. So men need to be aware of that. It needs to be something that we all appreciate and understand, and that, it's as best as we can protected against. It was horrifying, really. I've done male rape before, and I'm sure you have as well.
Yeah, I have.
We've all been involved. It's not something that's really, it's not reported, is it, as much in the mainstream media. But 48 men had been, I imagine, of all of the male rapes in the country that year, most of them were in one case. And it was something that people I know who've got sons, haven't they, going to uni and things like that. Everyone's terrified for their daughters, of course they are. But it's your sons as well. And that's what struck me, I think.
Yes. Well, Iain Simkin, thank you very much for talking law with me on here. It's been an absolute pleasure to hear about your career in law and your learnings. Thank you for all the advice.
Thank you, Sally. It was a pleasure.
A huge thank you to Iain Simkin for talking law with me, Sally Penni MBE. Please do catch up with our previous episodes where you can hear my conversation with guests such as Cherie Black, UC, and the owner of Thrive Law, Jodie Hill. If you've enjoyed this episode, then do share Talking Law with your friends and colleagues. You can also enjoy our other series, the Law and Guidance Podcast, which is all about the law, trial preparation, advocacy, and more. You can find me on Twitter @SallyPenny1 or search for Sally Penni or Women in the Law UK on LinkedIn or Instagram. Finally, don't forget the extensive resources for anyone working within the law available at womeninthelawyuk.com. Thanks to our production team, Sam Walker and Michael Blades at What Goes On Media.